Sarah Chen adjusted her laptop screen as the Boeing 747 reached cruising altitude, the soft hum of engines providing a familiar backdrop to what should have been another routine business trip from Los Angeles to Tokyo. At 34, she had made this journey countless times as regional director for Meridian Financial, but something felt different about Flight 882 today. Perhaps it was the unusual turbulence during takeoff, or the way the flight attendants seemed more tense than usual during their safety demonstration. Sarah dismissed these thoughts as pre-presentation nerves and returned to her quarterly reports, unaware that in less than 3 hours, her life would change forever in ways that would challenge everything she thought she knew about human capability under pressure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had always been methodical in her approach to life. Growing up in a family of engineers in Portland, Oregon, she learned early that problems had solutions if you remained calm and analyzed the situation logically. Her father, David Chen, had spent 30 years designing automotive safety systems, while her mother, Dr. Linda Chen, was an emergency room physician who had taught her daughter that panic was the enemy of clear thinking. These lessons had served Sarah well throughout her career in international finance, where she was known for her ability to navigate complex negotiations with corporations across the Pacific Rim. The morning had started typically enough. Sarah's alarm had sounded at 4:30 in her downtown Los Angeles apartment, giving her time for her usual routine of yoga, coffee, and a review of the presentation materials she would be delivering to the board of Nakamura Industries in Tokyo. The contract she was negotiating represented the largest deal in Meridian Financial's history, a $2.7 billion infrastructure investment that would establish her company as a major player in Asian markets. Everything had to be perfect. Her Uber had arrived precisely on schedule, navigating the early morning traffic toward LAX with the efficiency that Sarah demanded from all aspects of her professional life. She had chosen seat 7C specifically because it offered the best combination of legroom and minimal disruption from other passengers. The window seat gave her a view that helped with the mild claustrophobia she experienced on long flights, a quirk she had never mentioned to her colleagues, who saw her as unflappably confident in any situation. Captain Michael Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for Pacific Airways for 18 years, accumulating over 12,000 flight hours without a single incident more serious than minor turbulence delays. His routine pre-flight checks that morning had revealed nothing unusual about the aircraft, a Boeing 747-400 that had been in service for 8 years with an impeccable maintenance record. First Officer Janet Williams, with 6 years of experience and 3,000 flight hours, had joined Pacific Airways after serving as a transport pilot in the Air Force. Together, they represented the kind of experienced flight crew that passengers never thought to worry about, professionals whose competence was simply assumed. The passenger manifest for Flight 882 showed 247 souls aboard, including 12 crew members. In addition to Sarah, the business class section included a retiring ambassador returning to Japan after 40 years of diplomatic service, a technology executive from Silicon Valley, 2 professors from UCLA traveling to a conference on renewable energy, and a famous violinist whose Stradivarius was secured in the aircraft's climate-controlled cargo hold. The economy section carried the usual mixture of business travelers, families, and tourists, each with their own reasons for crossing the Pacific Ocean at 39,000 feet. Sarah settled into her seat with the practiced efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of long-haul travel. Her carry-on contained everything she might need: laptop with backup battery, printed copies of all presentation materials, noise-canceling headphones, and the small travel pillow that had accompanied her on business trips for the past 5 years. She had learned to think of the cabin as a mobile office, a space where she could accomplish meaningful work while crossing time zones. The takeoff had proceeded normally, though Sarah noticed that the aircraft seemed to labor slightly more than usual during the initial climb. She attributed this to the heavy fuel load required for the Trans-Pacific route and returned her attention to the financial projections that would determine whether Nakamura Industries would entrust Meridian Financial with their expansion into North American markets. The numbers were compelling, but she knew that international deals often succeeded or failed based on factors that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. 2 hours into the flight, Sarah was deep in concentration when she noticed the first officer emerging from the cockpit with an expression of concern that seemed carefully controlled. Janet Williams moved through the cabin with the purposeful stride of someone addressing a specific issue, stopping to speak quietly with the senior flight attendant near the galley. Their conversation was brief and conducted in voices too low for passengers to overhear, but Sarah's experience reading body language in high-stakes negotiations told her that something was amiss. The announcement came 20 minutes later, delivered in Captain Rodriguez's calm, professional tone that revealed nothing of the crisis developing in the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical issue that requires us to run through some additional procedures. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for possible course adjustment." The words were carefully chosen to inform without alarming, but Sarah felt her analytical mind beginning to assess the situation with the same focus she brought to evaluating investment risks. What the passengers didn't know was that Captain Rodriguez was experiencing symptoms that would soon incapacitate him completely. The severe chest pain that had begun as mild discomfort during the pre-flight briefing was now radiating down his left arm with an intensity that made it difficult to concentrate on his instruments. Years of rigorous physical training and medical examinations had never revealed the genetic predisposition to cardiac arrest that ran in his family, a ticking time bomb that chose this moment, 39,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, to finally detonate. First Officer Williams noticed her captain's distress when she returned to the cockpit and found him gripping the armrest of his seat with white knuckles, sweat beading on his forehead despite the controlled climate of the flight deck. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her Air Force training had prepared her for many emergency scenarios, but not for the rapid deterioration she was witnessing in the person responsible for the safety of nearly 250 lives. When Captain Rodriguez suddenly slumped forward against his controls, Janet Williams faced the most challenging moment of her aviation career. The Boeing 747 responded to the unconscious captain's weight against the control yoke by entering a shallow dive, the autopilot struggling to maintain course as conflicting inputs confused its programming. Williams immediately disengaged the autopilot and took manual control, fighting to stabilize the aircraft while simultaneously trying to revive her captain and alert air traffic control to their emergency. Her voice remained professionally calm as she transmitted their situation, but the magnitude of what she was facing became clear when Captain Rodriguez failed to respond to her attempts at resuscitation. Dr. Patricia Morrison, traveling in seat 12A on her way to a medical conference in Kyoto, responded immediately to the flight attendant's call for medical assistance. As a cardiologist with 25 years of experience, she recognized the symptoms of massive cardiac arrest within seconds of examining the unconscious captain. Her professional assessment was delivered with the brutal honesty that emergency situations demanded. Captain Rodriguez would not be returning to the controls during this flight, and his chances of survival even with immediate hospital intervention were marginal at best. The cabin crew faced a crisis that their extensive training had covered in theory, but never in practice. Senior Flight Attendant Maria Santos had 15 years of experience with Pacific Airways, but she had never dealt with the complete incapacitation of a captain during flight. The procedures were clear in the manual. The first officer assumes command, and the cabin crew assists in whatever way possible. But those procedures assumed that the first officer would be capable of safely completing the flight, an assumption that was about to be challenged in ways that no manual could anticipate. Sarah became aware of the developing crisis when she noticed the unusual activity level among the cabin crew. Her seat in 7C provided a clear view of the galley area, where flight attendants were engaged in hushed, urgent conversations punctuated by frequent glances toward the cockpit. The body language was unmistakable to someone trained to read the subtle signals that accompanied high-pressure negotiations. Something significant was happening, and the crew was working to manage it while keeping passengers calm. The second announcement came 40 minutes later, this time from First Officer Williams, whose voice carried a subtle tension that had not been present in the captain's earlier communication. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Williams speaking. We've encountered a medical emergency involving a crew member, and as a precautionary measure, we're going to request clearance for a priority approach to our destination. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and follow any instructions from the flight attendants." What Williams didn't announce was the growing realization that her own condition was becoming a factor in the crisis. The severe migraine that had begun shortly after taking manual control of the aircraft was intensifying with each passing minute, accompanied by vision disturbances that made it increasingly difficult to read her instruments clearly. The stress of managing a 747 with an incapacitated captain while dealing with her own medical issues was creating a cascade of problems that threatened to overwhelm her ability to safely complete the flight. Sarah's analytical mind processed the available information and reached conclusions that filled her with a cold dread she had never experienced in any boardroom crisis. The careful phrasing of the announcements, the increased activity among crew members, and the subtle changes in the aircraft's flight characteristics all pointed to a situation far more serious than a minor technical issue. Her iPhone showed no signal at their current altitude, making it impossible to contact her family or colleagues. But she found herself thinking not about the Nakamura deal, but about her parents and whether she would see them again. The crisis escalated rapidly. When First Officer Williams admitted to Dr. Morrison that her vision was becoming severely impaired, the migraine that had begun as manageable discomfort was now causing visual disturbances that made instrument reading dangerous. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed symptoms consistent with severe stress-induced migraine complicated by possible neurological factors that would require immediate medical attention. The impossible was becoming reality. A commercial airliner over the Pacific Ocean was losing both of its qualified pilots. Senior flight attendant Santos made the decision that would change everything. Following emergency protocols that seemed inadequate for their unprecedented situation, she used the aircraft's public address system to make an announcement that no passenger had ever heard before. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to ask if there are any licensed pilots aboard this aircraft. If you have any flight experience, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The silence that followed this request was deafening. Among the 235 passengers, there were doctors, engineers, business executives, professors, and artists, but no one with the specific expertise needed to safely land a Boeing 747. The closest thing to aviation experience belonged to Dr. James Fletcher in seat 23B, who held a private pilot's license for single-engine aircraft, but his honest assessment was that his weekend flying experience bore no resemblance to the complexity of commercial aviation. Sarah felt something shift inside her mind as she processed what she had just heard. The logical part of her brain that had built a successful career by analyzing complex problems was beginning to work on this situation with the same methodical approach she brought to international finance. She understood that someone would have to make decisions, take actions, and accept responsibility for outcomes that could affect nearly 250 lives. The alternative was unthinkable. Her hand was in the air before she fully realized she had made the decision. When flight attendant Santos approached her seat, Sarah heard herself saying words that seemed to come from someone else. "I don't have pilot training, but I have extensive experience with complex systems and crisis management. If there's absolutely no one else, I'm willing to try." The words hung in the air like a challenge to the laws of probability and common sense. Santos studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of panic, delusion, or false bravado. What she saw was the calm determination of someone who had spent years making difficult decisions under pressure. Sarah's business attire, her organized workspace, and her composed demeanor suggested someone accustomed to responsibility and capable of thinking clearly in crisis situations. With no other options available, Santos made the decision that would either save or doom everyone aboard Flight 882. The walk to the cockpit felt like crossing into another universe. Sarah had never been inside the flight deck of a commercial airliner, and the array of instruments, switches, and displays was overwhelming in its complexity. Captain Rodriguez lay unconscious in his seat, his condition obviously critical despite Dr. Morrison's ongoing efforts to stabilize him. First Officer Williams sat in the right seat, her face pale and her movements careful as she struggled with vision problems that were clearly worsening. Williams looked at Sarah with a mixture of desperation and hope that was heartbreaking in its intensity. "I can try to talk you through the basic controls, but landing this aircraft safely will require more than just following instructions. You'll need to make split-second decisions based on factors I can't anticipate from over here." Her voice carried the weight of someone passing an impossible burden to another person, knowing that failure would mean catastrophe for everyone aboard. Sarah settled into the captain's seat, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the control yoke. The aircraft felt alive beneath her, responding to minute inputs with movements that seemed both powerful and delicate. Through the cockpit windows, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. The instrument panel before her contained more information than she could process, but her mind began the same analytical approach that had served her in negotiations. Identify the critical elements, prioritize the most important factors, and focus on achievable objectives. The first lesson came immediately as Williams explained the primary flight display, the artificial horizon that would tell Sarah whether the aircraft was climbing, descending, or turning. "The most important thing is to keep the wings level and maintain steady altitude. The autopilot is helping with some functions, but you'll need to make manual inputs for any course corrections." The concept seemed simple in theory, but Sarah quickly discovered that smooth, precise control of a massive aircraft required a delicate touch that took years to develop. Air traffic control had been monitoring their situation since the first medical emergency report, and now controllers at Oakland Center were coordinating what they hoped would not become a disaster recovery operation. The senior controller, Patricia Adams, had 22 years of experience guiding aircraft through various emergencies, but she had never dealt with a situation involving an untrained person attempting to pilot a commercial airliner. Her voice remained professionally calm as she established radio contact with Sarah, but privately she was calculating the probability of a successful outcome and finding the numbers deeply troubling. Sarah's first radio transmission was halting but clear. "Oakland Center, this is Pacific Flight 882. I'm not a pilot, but I'm the only person available to fly this aircraft. I'm going to need a lot of help." The honesty in her voice was both refreshing and terrifying to everyone listening. Controllers immediately began coordinating with airline specialists, simulator instructors, and anyone else who might be able to provide guidance for an unprecedented situation. The Boeing 747 that Sarah was now responsible for represented 40 years of aerospace engineering innovation. With a maximum takeoff weight of 412,000 pounds, The aircraft was currently carrying enough fuel to remain airborne for several more hours. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines produced a combined total of over 200,000 pounds of thrust, power that could be devastating if mismanaged. The hydraulic systems that controlled the flight surfaces operated under pressures that could cause catastrophic failure if incorrectly manipulated. Sarah was now responsible for managing systems that most people couldn't understand even with extensive training. Williams continued her coaching despite the increasing severity of her own condition. Sarah, the most critical thing is airspeed control. Too slow and we'll stall. Too fast and we could damage the aircraft or lose control. The target speed for our current configuration is about 250 knots. She pointed to the airspeed indicator, one of the few instruments that Sarah found relatively intuitive. Small inputs on the throttles will change our speed, but the response isn't immediate. You have to anticipate what the aircraft will do. The concept of anticipating the aircraft's behavior proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of Sarah's crash course in aviation. In her business career, decisions produced relatively immediate results that could be evaluated and adjusted quickly. Flying a commercial airliner required thinking several steps ahead, making inputs based on predicted outcomes, and trusting that the aircraft would respond as expected. The margin for error was essentially zero, and the consequences of mistakes would be measured in lives rather than profit margins. Dr. Morrison divided her attention between Captain Rodriguez, whose condition remained critical but stable, and First Officer Williams, whose migraine symptoms were clearly worsening. The stress of the situation was affecting everyone differently, but the medical emergencies had created a perfect storm that left the aircraft's safety dependent on someone with no aviation training whatsoever. As a physician, Dr. Morrison understood that sometimes the most unlikely scenarios became reality, and survival depended on adapting to circumstances that no amount of planning could have anticipated. Sarah's first major test came when air traffic control requested a course correction to avoid conflicting traffic. The instruction seemed simple enough: turn 15 degrees to the right and maintain current altitude. But executing the turn required coordination between multiple controls, understanding of the aircraft's response characteristics, and the ability to stop the turn at precisely the right heading. Williams talked her through each step, but Sarah quickly learned that smooth, professional-looking maneuvers required skills that took years to develop. The turn was accomplished successfully, though not with the precision that passengers might have expected from an experienced crew. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and growing confidence as the aircraft settled onto its new heading without any dramatic upsets. The small victory provided reassurance that perhaps, with enough coaching and a considerable amount of luck, this impossible situation might have a positive outcome. But she also realized that turning was the easy part compared to what lay ahead. Communication with the outside world became a lifeline as airline specialists joined the growing group of people working to support Sarah's efforts. Captain Robert Martinez, Pacific Airways chief pilot instructor, positioned himself at the airline's operations center, where he could provide real-time guidance based on his 30 years of commercial flying experience. His first assessment of the situation was sobering. Landing a 747 safely required skills that typically took months to develop, even for experienced pilots transitioning from smaller aircraft. Captain Martinez's voice joined the radio frequency with calm authority that immediately reassured Sarah. Flight 882, this is Captain Martinez with Pacific Airways. I'm going to be working with you for the duration of this flight. I want you to know that what you're doing is incredibly brave, and we're going to do everything possible to get you and your passengers home safely. His words carried the confidence of someone who had trained countless pilots, but privately. He was calculating the enormous challenges that lay ahead. The Boeing 747 that Sarah was learning to fly had been designed with multiple redundant systems, precisely because aviation engineers understood that mechanical failures were inevitable. What they had not anticipated was the complete loss of qualified pilots, a scenario so unlikely that no specific procedures existed to address it. Sarah was essentially writing new emergency protocols in real time, guided by experts on the ground, who had never faced anything comparable to her situation. Weather conditions were becoming a factor as meteorologists tracked a developing storm system that could affect their approach to either Los Angeles or their alternate destination in San Francisco. The added complexity of landing in poor weather would multiply the challenges Sarah faced exponentially. Captain Martinez began calculating fuel consumption rates and discussing options with air traffic control, knowing that every decision would affect the margin for error in what was already an almost impossible situation. Sarah's business training had taught her to consider multiple scenarios and develop contingency plans for various outcomes. She applied this same methodology to her current situation, discussing with Captain Martinez the relative merits of attempting a landing at LAX versus San Francisco, the implications of different approach procedures, and the possibility of further complications that might arise. Her analytical approach impressed the aviation professionals supporting her, even as they remained deeply concerned about her lack of technical flying skills. The passenger cabin had gradually become aware that their situation was far more serious than initially announced. Senior flight attendant Santos made the decision to be honest with passengers about their circumstances, while emphasizing that everything possible was being done to ensure their safety. The announcement was carefully worded to provide information without creating panic, but the reality was impossible to disguise completely. They were depending on someone with no flying experience to safely land one of the largest passenger aircraft in the world. Reactions among passengers varied widely based on personality and life experience. Some, like retired Ambassador William Hartley in seat 4A, remained outwardly calm while privately making peace with the possibility that this flight might be their last. Others, including technology executive Mark Chen, used their smartphones to send what might be final messages to family members. The violinist in seat 8B, Elena Volkov, found herself thinking about the Stradivarius in the cargo hold and whether anyone would ever play it again. Dr. Fletcher, the private pilot in economy class, made his way to the cockpit to offer whatever assistance his limited experience might provide. While his weekend flying in small aircraft bore little resemblance to commercial aviation, he understood basic flight principles and could serve as an additional resource for monitoring instruments and providing backup support. His presence gave Sarah another qualified person to consult, even though his expertise was far from comprehensive for their current situation. The complexity of modern commercial aviation became apparent as Sarah learned about systems she had never imagined. The flight management computer that normally handled navigation and performance calculations was designed to be operated by pilots with extensive training in its use. The weather radar that could help identify dangerous storm cells required interpretation, skills that took years to develop. The multiple radio frequencies needed for communication with various air traffic control facilities demanded familiarity with aviation procedures that Sarah was learning in real time. Captain Martinez began focusing on the most critical decision they would face: where and how to attempt a landing. Los Angeles International Airport offered the advantage of familiar surroundings for the aircraft's planned destination, but the complex airspace and multiple runways could create navigation challenges for someone learning to fly. San Francisco International Airport had weather conditions that might be more favorable, but it would require additional fuel consumption and navigation to an unfamiliar location. The choice was complicated by Captain Rodriguez's medical condition, which Dr. Morrison reported was stabilizing but remained critical. The nearest suitable medical facilities were at LAX, where trauma specialists were already being alerted to their situation. First Officer Williams' condition was also deteriorating, with her migraine symptoms now including severe nausea that made it difficult for her to provide consistent guidance. Time was becoming a factor in ways that multiplied the pressure on everyone involved. Sarah found herself drawing on mental resources she had never accessed before. The meditation techniques her mother had taught her for managing stress proved valuable for maintaining focus under unprecedented pressure. The project management skills she had developed, coordinating international business deals, helped her organize the multiple streams of information flowing from air traffic control, airline specialists, and the aircraft's instruments. Most importantly, the confidence she had built through years of successful problem-solving gave her the psychological foundation to attempt something that most people would consider impossible. The fuel situation became a critical consideration as Captain Martinez calculated their remaining options. The 747 was burning approximately 4,000 gallons per hour, giving them roughly 3 hours of remaining flight time at their current consumption rate. This provided a window for coaching and practice, but it also established a deadline beyond which their options would become severely limited. Every minute spent in preparation was one less minute available for multiple approach attempts if the first landing effort failed. Air traffic control began the complex process of clearing airspace around, lax in preparation for what they hoped would not become a mass casualty event. Emergency services at the airport were positioned along the longest runway with phone trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment standing by for various possible outcomes. The coordination involved dozens of agencies and hundreds of people, all working to support one person's desperate attempt to accomplish something she had never been trained to do. Sarah's confidence grew incrementally as she became more familiar with the aircraft's responses to her inputs. The 747 was remarkably stable in flight, its size and weight providing a steadiness that made small corrections relatively forgiving. But she also learned that the aircraft's mass meant that changes in configuration or power settings had effects that developed slowly and required patience to evaluate properly. Every lesson was acquired through direct experience with no opportunity for practice or repetition. The psychological challenge proved as demanding as the technical requirements. Sarah had to manage her own fear and uncertainty while projecting confidence for the passengers and crew who were depending on her leadership. The weight of responsibility for nearly 250 lives was unlike anything she had experienced in her business career, where mistakes might cost money but rarely endangered human life. She found herself thinking about each passenger as an individual with families, dreams, and responsibilities that would be cut short if she failed. Communication with her parents became possible when the aircraft descended to an altitude where cell phone signals could reach towers along the California coast. Sarah's brief conversation with her mother, Dr. Chen, provided emotional support that strengthened her resolve. Her mother's words were simple but powerful. "You have everything you need inside you to handle this situation. Trust your training. Trust your instincts, and remember that fear is just information that you can choose to use or ignore." The approach to Los Angeles International Airport would require Sarah to demonstrate skills that commercial pilots spent months developing. In-flight simulators. The precision required for a safe landing involved managing multiple variables simultaneously: airspeed, altitude, rate of descent, aircraft configuration, and runway alignment. Each factor affected all the others, creating a complex equation that experienced pilots solved through training, practice, and intuitive understanding developed over thousands of flight hours. Captain Martinez began the most critical phase of his coaching as they prepared for their approach to LAX. "Sarah, landing this aircraft safely is going to require you to trust the process even when it feels uncomfortable. The approach will seem steep and fast compared to anything you might expect, but that's normal for a 747. Your job is to make small, smooth corrections, and resist the temptation to overcorrect when things don't feel right immediately. The concept of energy management became central to Sarah's crash course in aviation. The massive aircraft possessed enormous kinetic energy that had to be dissipated gradually during the approach and landing. Too much energy would result in an approach that was too fast or too high, potentially causing them to overshoot the runway or land too hard. Too little energy could result in a stall or uncontrolled descent that would be equally catastrophic. The balance required intuitive understanding that normally took years to develop. Air traffic control provided vectors that would bring flight 882 to the approach course for runway 25 left at LAX, the longest available runway that would provide the maximum margin for error. The approach would require Sarah to descend from cruising altitude while reducing airspeed and configuring the aircraft for landing. Each step involved multiple systems and procedures that had to be accomplished in the correct sequence to avoid dangerous situations. Dr. Morrison continued monitoring both incapacitated crew members while also observing Sarah for signs of stress or fatigue that might compromise her ability to complete the flight. The physician's experience with emergency situations had taught her that people were capable of extraordinary performance under extreme pressure, but she also knew that everyone had limits beyond which critical mistakes became inevitable. Sarah's continued composure and methodical approach to learning impressed Dr. Morrison professionally and personally. The passenger cabin remained remarkably calm considering the circumstances. Senior flight attendant Santos and her crew had managed to maintain order through honest communication and professional competence that reassured passengers without minimizing the seriousness of their situation. Some passengers were writing letters to family members, others were reading or listening to music, and a few were actually sleeping despite the crisis. The human capacity for adaptation under stress was demonstrating itself throughout the aircraft. Sarah's first view of the California coastline through the cockpit windows provided a reference point that helped her visualize their progress toward LAX. The familiar landmarks of Los Angeles spread out below them, a vast urban landscape that included millions of people who had no idea that a drama involving their city's airport was developing in the sky above them. The sight of land after hours over the Pacific Ocean was reassuring, but it also marked the beginning of the most challenging phase of their flight. The decision to begin their descent required careful coordination between Sarah's inputs and the aircraft's automated systems. Captain Martinez talked her through the process of reducing power and lowering the nose to establish a controlled descent. Rate. The 747 responded predictably to her inputs, but Sarah quickly learned that small changes in configuration had large effects on the aircraft's behavior that developed over time rather than immediately. Los Angeles approach control took over their flight guidance as they entered the terminal area airspace. Controller Patricia Chen, who happened to share Sarah's surname though they were not related, had worked hundreds of emergency situations during her career, but nothing comparable to guiding an untrained person through a commercial aircraft approach. Her voice remained professionally calm as she provided vectors and altitude assignments, but privately she was praying for a successful outcome to an almost impossible situation. The complexity of the approach phase became apparent as Sarah learned about the multiple steps required to configure the aircraft for landing. The flaps and slats that provided additional lift at slower speeds had to be extended gradually in coordination with speed and power reductions. The landing gear deployment would change the aircraft's aerodynamics and require further adjustments to maintain stable flight. Each configuration change was a new lesson in aircraft behavior that Sarah had to master in real time. First Officer Williams, despite her continued medical difficulties, provided what guidance she could for the approach procedures. Her Air Force experience had included some training in emergency situations, though nothing comparable to their current circumstances. She helped Sarah understand the relationship between power settings and airspeed control, concepts that would be critical for maintaining stable flight during the final approach to landing. The fuel situation remained manageable but required constant monitoring as they burned through their reserves during the extended approach procedures. Captain Martinez calculated that they had sufficient fuel for one approach attempt with limited opportunity for a second try if the first landing effort failed. This reality added pressure to a situation that was already challenging beyond normal limits, but it also focused everyone's attention on the critical importance of getting everything right the first time. Sarah's business experience with high-stakes negotiations proved unexpectedly relevant to her current situation. Both scenarios involved managing multiple complex variables simultaneously, while making critical decisions under extreme pressure. Her ability to remain focused on essential objectives while filtering out distracting information served her well as she learned to fly one of the world's most sophisticated aircraft with coaching from experts who had never faced anything like their current emergency. The weather conditions at LAX remained within acceptable limits for a normal landing, but they added another layer of complexity to Sarah's already overwhelming challenges. Wind conditions required continuous adjustments to maintain proper runway. Alignment and visibility restrictions meant that she would be depending primarily on instruments rather than visual references during the critical final stages of approach. These factors would have been challenging for an experienced pilot and were potentially overwhelming for someone learning to fly in real time. Dr. Fletcher's presence in the cockpit provided additional support for monitoring instruments and procedures. Though his experience with small aircraft offered limited guidance for commercial aviation systems, his understanding of basic flight principles helped him serve as a backup resource for Sarah, while Captain Martinez and First Officer Williams focused on the most critical aspects of her training. The teamwork that developed among the group provided a foundation for attempting something that no individual could have accomplished alone. The approach clearance from Los Angeles Tower marked the beginning of the final phase of Flight 882's journey. Sarah would now have to demonstrate everything she had learned during her improvised training while managing an aircraft that weighed nearly 400,000 pounds, at speeds that left no margin for error. The lives of everyone aboard depended on her ability to apply lessons learned through direct experience to the most demanding test any pilot could face. Captain Martinez's voice carried calm authority as he began the final coaching sequence that would guide Sarah through her approach. To runway 25 left. Sarah, everything you've learned up to this point has prepared you for what comes next. Trust your training, trust the aircraft, and trust yourself. You have the capability to bring everyone home safely. His words provided reassurance at the moment when Sarah needed it most, as she prepared to attempt something that would challenge the limits of human adaptability and determination. The lights of Los Angeles International Airport became visible in the distance, marking their destination and the end of a journey that had transformed from routine business travel into an unprecedented test of human capability under impossible circumstances. Sarah Chen, who had begun this flight as a successful business executive, was about to discover reserves of strength and skill that she had never imagined she possessed. The outcome would depend on her ability to apply everything she had learned. During the most intensive and consequential training session of her life, the Boeing 747's descent through 25,000 feet marked Sarah's entry into controlled airspace where every decision would be scrutinized by multiple agencies, monitoring their emergency. Los Angeles Approach Control had cleared a corridor specifically for Flight 882, diverting commercial traffic to alternate routes while emergency services positioned themselves along the airport's perimeter. Sarah felt the weight of this coordinated response, knowing that hundreds of professionals were now invested in the outcome of her desperate attempt to land an aircraft she had never been trained to fly. Captain Martinez's voice remained steady through her headset as he guided her through the complex process of preparing the massive aircraft for its final approach. The fuel flow indicators showed consumption rates that gave them approximately 45 minutes of remaining flight time, creating a deadline that added urgency to every instruction and decision. Sarah's hands moved across controls that still felt foreign despite her rapid education in their operation. Each switch and lever representing systems that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe for everyone aboard. The passenger cabin had settled into an eerie calm that senior flight attendant Santos recognized from her training in crisis psychology. People facing circumstances beyond their control often developed a detached acceptance that allowed them to function despite overwhelming stress. Conversations had become quieter and more personal, with strangers sharing stories and contact information for family members they might never see again. The businessman in seat 15C was teaching origami to a frightened child across the aisle, while the elderly couple in row 22 held hands and spoke in whispers about their 50-year marriage. Dr. Morrison continued her vigilant monitoring of Captain Rodriguez, whose condition remained stable but critical. The sophisticated medical equipment available in her hospital practice would have provided better assessment tools, but her years of emergency medicine experience allowed her to evaluate his status using basic techniques that required no technology. His breathing was regular and his pulse stable, but the severity of his cardiac event meant that even with immediate hospital intervention, his prognosis remained uncertain. The parallel medical emergency involving First Officer Williams complicated the situation further, as her migraine symptoms showed no signs of improvement despite the medication Dr. Morrison had administered. Sarah's view through the cockpit windows revealed the sprawling landscape of Southern California spread out below them like a detailed map come to life. The geometric patterns of suburban streets, the serpentine curves of freeways filled with evening traffic, and the distant glitter of downtown Los Angeles created a vista that was both beautiful and intimidating. Somewhere in that vast urban expanse were her parents, probably unaware that their daughter was attempting something that would be considered impossible by anyone who understood the complexities of commercial aviation. The first major test of Sarah's developing skills came when Los Angeles Approach Control issued a vector change that required a precise turn to align with the approach course for runway 25 left. Captain Martinez had explained the theory behind coordinated turns, but executing them smoothly in a 747 required a delicate touch that Sarah was still developing. She applied gentle pressure to the control yoke while adding rudder input to coordinate the turn, feeling the massive aircraft respond with what seemed like reluctant cooperation to her amateur technique. The turn was accomplished successfully, though passengers with aviation experience might have noticed the slight oscillations that indicated an inexperienced hand at the controls. Dr. Fletcher, observing from the cockpit's jump seat, recognized the challenges Sarah faced in transitioning from the theoretical knowledge she was receiving through her headset to the practical application required for safe flight. His own experience with small aircraft had taught him that flying was as much art as science, requiring intuitive understanding that typically developed through years of practice. Air traffic control's radar screens showed Flight 882 descending through 15,000 feet on a course that would intercept the instrument landing system for runway 25 left. Controller Patricia Chen coordinated with her colleagues to ensure that no other aircraft would conflict with their approach path, creating a protected corridor that extended for 30 miles around the airport. The complexity of this coordination involved multiple facilities and dozens of controllers, all working to provide Sarah with the safest possible environment for her unprecedented attempt at landing a commercial airliner. The instrument landing system that would guide Sarah's approach represented decades of technological development, designed to allow aircraft to land safely in conditions of poor visibility. The localizer beam provided lateral guidance to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway center line, while the glide slope beam indicated the proper descent angle for a safe approach. These invisible electronic pathways would be Sarah's primary reference during the final phase of flight, requiring her to interpret instrument indications that experienced pilots spent months learning to read accurately. Captain Martinez began preparing Sarah for the most challenging phase of their flight by explaining the relationship between airspeed, power settings, and aircraft configuration during approach. The 747's massive weight meant that energy management required careful planning and precise execution, with changes in power or configuration producing effects that developed gradually rather than immediately. Sarah would need to anticipate the aircraft's behavior several steps ahead, making adjustments based on predicted rather than observed results. The concept of stabilized approach became central to their preparation, as Captain Martinez explained that successful landings required establishing proper speed, descent rate, and configuration well before reaching the runway. Commercial aviation safety depended on standardized procedures that eliminated variables and reduced the opportunity for pilot error. But Sarah's situation required adaptation of these procedures to accommodate her limited experience and the unique circumstances they faced together. Weather conditions at Los Angeles International Airport remained within acceptable parameters, with winds from the west at 12 knots and visibility greater than 10 miles. These conditions would be considered routine for an experienced crew, but they still presented challenges for someone learning to fly in real time. Wind correction techniques that experienced pilots applied instinctively would require conscious thought and calculation from Sarah, adding another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. The decision to extend the aircraft's flaps for the first time during their flight marked a significant milestone in Sarah's education. Captain Martinez explained that flap extension would change the aircraft's lift characteristics and require adjustments to power and trim settings to maintain stable flight. Sarah felt the aircraft's behavior change as the flaps deployed, requiring her to make control inputs that seemed counterintuitive but were necessary for maintaining proper airspeed and attitude. First Officer Williams, despite her continuing medical difficulties, provided guidance for the complex process of configuring the aircraft for landing. Her experience with Air Force transport operations included training in emergency procedures, though nothing that directly applied to their current situation. She helped Sarah understand the sequence of configuration changes that would be required during their approach, each step building on the previous one to prepare the aircraft for the critical final phase of flight. The communication between Sarah and the various experts supporting her effort had evolved into an efficient system that maximized the flow of critical information while minimizing distracting chatter. Captain Martinez served as her primary instructor for flying techniques, while air traffic control provided navigation guidance and airport information. Dr. Fletcher monitored secondary instruments and systems, allowing Sarah to focus on the primary flight controls that demanded her complete attention. Fuel management became an increasingly important consideration as their approach time extended beyond original estimates. The additional vectors required for spacing and configuration meant that they were consuming fuel at rates that reduced their margin for error if multiple approach attempts became necessary. Captain Martinez calculated that they had sufficient fuel for one complete approach with limited reserves for a second attempt, creating pressure to achieve success on their first try. The psychological demands of the situation began testing Sarah's mental resources in ways that her business career had never required. Maintaining focus while processing multiple streams of technical information demanded concentration that was both intense and sustained. Unlike the episodic pressure she had experienced during important negotiations, the knowledge that hundreds of lives depended on her ability to learn and execute complex procedures under extreme stress created a burden that few people had ever been asked to carry. Sarah's meditation practice, taught by her mother during her college years, provided techniques for managing the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her logical thinking. Controlled breathing exercises helped maintain her heart rate within reasonable limits, while visualization techniques allowed her to mentally rehearse the procedures she would soon have to execute for real. These psychological tools proved as valuable as any technical instruction she received from the aviation experts supporting her effort. The view from the cockpit windows began showing familiar landmarks as they descended through 10,000 feet on their approach to LAX. The distinctive architecture of Los Angeles International Airport became visible in the distance, with its iconic theme building and multiple terminal complexes spread across thousands of acres. Sarah recognized the airport from her many business trips, but seeing it from the perspective of someone responsible for safely landing an aircraft, there created an entirely different emotional impact. Los Angeles Tower assumed control of their flight as they entered the airport's immediate airspace, with controller Sarah Kim providing final approach guidance that would bring them to the runway threshold. The coordination between multiple control facilities had been seamless, creating a protected environment that eliminated external complications and allowed Sarah to focus entirely on the challenge of flying the aircraft. This level of support represented the aviation industry's commitment to safety and its recognition that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures. Dr. Morrison's assessment of the medical situations affecting both incapacitated crew members remained stable but concerning. Captain Rodriguez showed no signs of consciousness returning, while First Officer Williams continued experiencing symptoms that made sustained concentration difficult. The physician's presence provided reassurance that medical emergencies were being handled professionally, but it also served as a constant reminder of how quickly circumstances could change during their approach and landing attempt. The Boeing 747's massive size became apparent to Sarah as she learned about the aircraft's unique handling characteristics during slow flight. The wing's enormous surface area provided tremendous lift capacity, but it also created momentum effects that required careful management during configuration changes. Power adjustments produced results more slowly than in smaller aircraft, requiring Sarah to anticipate the aircraft's needs and make inputs before they became obviously necessary. Captain Martinez began the critical phase of coaching that would prepare Sarah for intercepting the instrument landing system beams that would guide their final approach. The localizer and glide slope signals required interpretation skills that commercial pilots developed through extensive simulator training, but Sarah would have to learn these techniques through direct application while flying a real aircraft, carrying real passengers toward a real runway where the margin for error was essentially zero. The complexity of modern aviation technology became both a blessing and a challenge as Sarah learned to use systems designed to enhance safety while requiring specialized knowledge for proper operation. The flight management computer could calculate optimal approach speeds and descent rates, but accessing this information required navigation through menu systems that were designed for trained pilots. The weather radar could identify potentially dangerous conditions, but interpreting its displays required experience that Sarah was acquiring in real time. Emergency services at Los Angeles International Airport had positioned themselves along runway 25 left in preparation for various possible outcomes of Flight 882's approach. Fire rescue vehicles carried specialized foam for aircraft fires, while ambulances stood ready to respond to medical emergencies involving passengers or crew. The coordination of these resources represented years of planning for scenarios that everyone hoped would never occur, but which required preparation for the safety of everyone who used the airport. Sarah's confidence continued building incrementally as she successfully managed each new challenge that Captain Martinez introduced during their approach preparation. The aircraft's responses to her control inputs became more predictable as she developed an intuitive understanding of its behavior, though she remained acutely aware that landing would require precision that was far beyond anything she had yet demonstrated. Each small success provided psychological reinforcement that helped maintain her focus on the ultimate objective of bringing everyone home safely. The passenger cabin maintained its atmosphere of controlled tension as senior flight attendant. Santos and her crew continued providing reassurance through their professional competence and calm demeanor. Passengers had been briefed on emergency landing procedures, without being told specific details about Sarah's lack of flying experience. A decision made to provide necessary information while avoiding panic that could complicate an already difficult situation. The crew's ability to maintain order and confidence under these circumstances demonstrated the quality of training that commercial aviation demanded. Communication with her family became possible again as the aircraft descended to altitudes where cellular signals could reach ground-based towers. Sarah's brief conversation with her father provided emotional support that strengthened her resolve while also creating additional pressure to succeed. David Chen's background in automotive safety engineering gave him some understanding of the technical challenges his daughter faced, but his primary message was personal rather than technical, that he and her mother believed in her ability to handle whatever situation she encountered. The concept of energy management that Captain Martinez had introduced earlier became increasingly important as they prepared for the final approach phase. The massive aircraft possessed enormous kinetic energy that had to be dissipated gradually and precisely during the descent to landing. Too much energy would result in an approach that was too fast or too high, while too little energy could cause a stall or uncontrolled descent. The balance required understanding that experienced pilots developed through thousands of hours of flight time. Los Angeles Approach Control provided final vectors that would establish Flight 882 on the localizer course for runway 25 left, beginning the instrument approach that would either end in successful landing or catastrophic failure. Sarah felt the weight of this transition as the aircraft's navigation systems captured the electronic signals that would guide them toward the runway. Everything she had learned during her improvised training would now be tested in the most demanding environment that aviation could provide. The decision to lower the landing gear marked another critical milestone in their approach preparation. Captain Martinez explained that gear extension would significantly change the aircraft's aerodynamic characteristics, requiring immediate adjustments to power and trim to maintain stable flight. Sarah felt the aircraft shudder slightly as the massive gear assemblies deployed, followed by changes in flight behavior that required her constant attention to maintain proper airspeed and altitude. Dr. Fletcher's assistance became increasingly valuable as the complexity of approach procedures multiplied the demands on Sarah's attention. His ability to monitor secondary instruments and call out important information allowed her to focus on primary flight controls while maintaining awareness of systems that could affect their safety. The teamwork that had developed among the small group in the cockpit provided a foundation for attempting something that no individual could have accomplished alone. Weather updates from Los Angeles Tower confirmed that conditions remained suitable for their approach attempt, though crosswind components would require continuous corrections to maintain proper runway alignment. Sarah's introduction to wind correction techniques came through Captain Martinez's patient explanation of how to maintain desired ground track while compensating for air mass movement that could push the aircraft away from its intended path. These corrections required constant attention and adjustment throughout the approach phase. The fuel situation remained manageable, but required careful monitoring as they consumed reserves during the extended approach procedures. Captain Martinez calculated consumption rates and advised air traffic control of their fuel state, ensuring that priority handling would continue throughout their landing attempt. The knowledge that they had limited opportunity for multiple approaches added urgency to their preparation and increased the importance of executing each procedure correctly on the first attempt. Sarah's business experience with complex project management proved unexpectedly relevant as she coordinated multiple information streams while maintaining focus on critical objectives, her ability to prioritize essential tasks while delegating secondary responsibilities to team members served her well in managing the overwhelming complexity of flying a commercial aircraft. The leadership skills she had developed through years of international negotiations provided a psychological framework for handling pressure that few people had ever experienced. The approach checklist that First Officer Williams managed despite her medical difficulties provided a systematic framework for ensuring that all necessary procedures were completed in the correct sequence. Each item represented years of aviation experience distilled into standardized procedures designed to eliminate variables and reduce the opportunity for error. Sarah's rapid education in these procedures compressed months of normal training into a few hours of intensive instruction. The sight of runway 25 left, appearing in the distance through the cockpit windows, provided a visual reference that helped Sarah understand their progress toward landing. The runway appeared impossibly narrow from their current altitude and distance, though she knew it was actually one of the longest runways in Southern California. Captain Martinez explained that this visual illusion was normal during approaches, and that she would need to trust her instruments rather than relying solely on visual impressions that could be misleading. Emergency coordination between multiple agencies continued as Flight 882 descended through 5,000 feet on their approach to LAX. The airport's Emergency Operations Center served as the focal point for coordinating resources that included medical personnel, fire and rescue teams, airport operations staff, and law enforcement agencies. The complexity of this coordination demonstrated the aviation industry's commitment to safety and its ability to respond to unprecedented emergencies. Sarah's understanding of aircraft systems continued expanding as Captain Martinez introduced concepts that would be critical during the final approach phase. The relationship between power settings and descent rate required constant adjustment to maintain the proper glide path, while speed control demanded anticipation of the aircraft's response to throttle inputs. These skills typically required months of development in flight simulators before pilots were allowed to practice them in actual aircraft. The psychological pressure of knowing that her performance was being monitored by aviation experts around the world added another dimension to Sarah's already overwhelming challenges. Air traffic control recordings were being analyzed in real time by airline safety specialists, while news media began reporting on the unprecedented emergency developing over Los Angeles. The knowledge that her actions would be scrutinized and analyzed for years to come created additional motivation to succeed while also increasing the pressure to perform flawlessly. First Officer Williams, despite her continuing medical difficulties, provided critical information about the aircraft's automated systems that could assist during the approach phase. The auto-throttle system could help maintain target airspeeds if properly configured, while the flight director provided visual guidance that could supplement the instrument landing system signals. Sarah's rapid education in these advanced systems compressed years of normal training into the most intensive and consequential learning experience of her life. The decision to configure the aircraft for its final approach setting marked the beginning of the most critical phase of Flight 882's journey. Sarah would now have to demonstrate everything she had learned while managing an aircraft that weighed nearly 400,000 pounds in an environment where the smallest mistake could result in catastrophe. The outcome would depend on her ability to apply improvised training to the most demanding test that aviation could provide, with the lives of everyone aboard hanging in the balance of her performance. The final approach phase began when Los Angeles Tower cleared Flight 882 for the instrument landing system approach to runway 25 left, a moment that transformed Sarah from a student of aviation into the person solely responsible for bringing 247 souls safely to Earth. Captain Martinez's voice carried a different tone now, less instructional and more supportive. As he recognized that Sarah had absorbed as much technical knowledge as possible and would now have to rely on instinct, determination, and whatever natural ability she possessed for controlling the massive Boeing 747, the localizer beam captured the aircraft's navigation system with a precision that Sarah found both reassuring and terrifying. The electronic pathway that would guide her to the runway represented decades of technological advancement, but it also marked the point of no return, where theoretical knowledge would be tested against the unforgiving reality of bringing nearly 400,000 pounds of aircraft safely to the ground. Her hands moved across the controls with increasing confidence, though she remained acutely aware that everything she had learned was about to be tested in circumstances that no amount of preparation could fully simulate. Sarah's first glimpse of the runway threshold through the cockpit windows created an emotional impact that she had not anticipated. The parallel lines of approach lights stretched into the distance like a pathway to salvation, though she knew that reaching that sanctuary would require executing procedures with a precision that experienced pilots spent years developing. The runway appeared both impossibly distant and frighteningly close, a paradox that Captain Martinez had warned her about, but still caught her unprepared for its psychological impact. The glide slope intercept occurred exactly as Captain Martinez had predicted, with the aircraft's flight director providing visual guidance that helped Sarah understand when to begin their descent toward the runway. The transition from level flight to the controlled descent required for landing demanded constant adjustments to power and attitude that tested every skill she had acquired during her improvised training. The Boeing 747 responded to her inputs with the massive momentum that characterized all of its behavior, requiring her to think several steps ahead of the aircraft's current state. Dr. Morrison continued her vigilant monitoring of both incapacitated crew members while also observing Sarah for signs of stress or fatigue that might compromise her ability to complete the approach. Captain Rodriguez remained unconscious but stable, his breathing regular and his vital signs indicating that immediate medical intervention upon landing might still prove successful. First Officer Williams had shown slight improvement in her migraine symptoms, though she remained unable to provide the kind of detailed guidance that the situation ideally required. The passenger cabin had achieved a state of focused calm that Senior Flight Attendant Santos recognized from her emergency training as the optimal condition for managing crisis situations. Conversations had become quieter and more personal, with many passengers using the time to write messages to family members or simply reflect on their lives with the clarity that often accompanied brush encounters with mortality. The crew continued their professional duties while maintaining the reassuring presence that helped passengers manage their anxiety about circumstances beyond anyone's control. Air traffic control had cleared all other aircraft from the approach corridor, creating a protected pathway that extended for 20 miles around the airport. Controller Sarah Kim maintained constant communication with Flight 882 while coordinating with emergency services positioned along the runway. The complexity of this coordination involved dozens of agencies and hundreds of people, all working to provide the safest possible environment for an attempt that everyone understood was unprecedented. In commercial aviation history, the concept of airspeed control became critical as Sarah learned to manage the relationship between power settings and the aircraft's energy state during the approach. Captain Martinez's coaching focused on maintaining target speeds that would ensure adequate control authority while avoiding the extremes of flying too fast or too slow. The massive aircraft's momentum meant that speed changes occurred gradually, requiring Sarah to anticipate the aircraft's needs and make power adjustments before they became obviously necessary. Emergency services at Los Angeles International Airport had positioned themselves in configurations designed to respond to various possible outcomes of Flight 882's landing attempt. Fire rescue vehicles with specialized foam capability flanked the runway at strategic intervals, while medical teams stood ready to provide immediate assistance for both crew and passengers. The coordination of these resources represented years of planning for scenarios that everyone hoped would never occur, but which required preparation for the safety of everyone who used the airport. Sarah's meditation techniques, learned from her mother during college, provided psychological tools for managing the stress that threatened to overwhelm her concentration. Controlled breathing exercises helped maintain her heart rate within manageable limits, while mental visualization allowed her to rehearse the procedures she would soon execute for real. These techniques proved as valuable as any technical instruction she received from the aviation experts supporting her unprecedented attempt. The decision to extend full flaps marked the final configuration change before landing, transforming the Boeing 747 into its lowest speed flight regime, where precise control inputs became even more critical. Sarah felt the aircraft's behavior change dramatically as the massive wing flaps deployed, requiring immediate adjustments to power and trim that tested her developing understanding of the aircraft's flight characteristics. The change in the aircraft's appearance was visible through the cockpit windows as the wing transformed into its landing configuration. Captain Martinez began the final phase of his coaching as they descended through 1,000 feet, focusing on the fengde visual cues that would help Sarah judge her approach path and landing technique. The runway environment provided reference points that could supplement her instrument guidance, though she would need to learn to interpret these visual signals while simultaneously managing multiple aircraft systems. The integration of visual and instrument flying skills represented one of the most challenging aspects of landing a commercial aircraft. Dr. Fletcher's assistance became increasingly valuable as the approach workload multiplied the demands on Sarah's attention span. His ability to monitor secondary systems and call out critical information allowed her to focus on primary flight controls while maintaining awareness of engine parameters, hydraulic systems, and other components that could affect their landing attempt. The teamwork that had developed among the small group in the cockpit provided a foundation for attempting something that no individual could have accomplished alone. The fuel situation provided adequate reserves for their current approach with limited capability for a missed approach if their first landing attempt proved unsuccessful. Captain Martinez monitored their consumption rates while providing air traffic control with updates on their fuel state, ensuring that priority handling would continue throughout their landing sequence. The knowledge that they had essentially one opportunity to succeed added urgency to every decision and procedure, while eliminating the luxury of multiple practice attempts. Weather conditions at Los Angeles International Airport remained within acceptable parameters, though crosswind components required continuous corrections to maintain proper runway alignment. Sarah's introduction to wind correction techniques came through Captain Martinez's real-time coaching as she learned to maintain the desired ground track while compensating for air mass movement that constantly threatened to push the aircraft away from the runway centerline. These corrections demanded constant attention and micro-adjustments throughout the final approach phase. The sight of emergency vehicles positioned along the runway created a sobering reminder of the potential consequences of Sarah's landing attempt proved unsuccessful. The presence of these resources was both reassuring and intimidating, representing the aviation industry's commitment to safety while also acknowledging the serious risks inherent in their current situation. Sarah forced herself to focus on positive outcomes while acknowledging the reality that emergency services might be needed regardless of her best efforts. Sarah's business experience with high-pressure negotiations provided psychological frameworks for managing the stress of making critical decisions under extreme time pressure. Her ability to maintain focus on essential objectives while filtering out distracting information served her well as she managed the overwhelming complexity of flying a commercial aircraft during its most demanding phase of flight. The confidence she had built through years of successful problem-solving gave her the mental foundation necessary for attempting something that most people would consider impossible. The approach checklist managed by First Officer Williams, despite her medical difficulties, provided systematic verification that all necessary procedures had been completed in the correct sequence. Each item represented years of aviation experience distilled into standardized protocols designed to eliminate variables and reduce opportunities for error. Sarah's rapid education in these procedures compressed months of normal training into hours of intensive instruction applied under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Communication between Sarah and Captain Martinez evolved into an efficient system that maximized the flow of critical information, while minimizing distracting chatter that could interfere with her concentration. His coaching focused on immediate needs while providing anticipatory guidance for situations she would encounter during the next few minutes of flight. The trust that had developed between them created a foundation for attempting a landing that would challenge the limits of human adaptability under extreme pressure. The Boeing 747's massive size became both an advantage and a challenge as Sarah learned about the aircraft's unique characteristics during the final approach phase. The wing's enormous surface area provided tremendous lift capacity that made the aircraft relatively stable in flight, but it also created momentum effects that required careful management during the transition from approach to landing. Power adjustments produced results more slowly than in smaller aircraft, demanding that Sarah anticipate the aircraft's needs well before they became obviously apparent. Los Angeles Tower provided final approach guidance that would bring Flight 882 to the runway threshold at the optimal speed and descent rate for a safe landing. Controller Sarah Kim's voice remained professionally calm while coordinating with emergency services and providing Sarah with wind updates and other critical information. The coordination between multiple control facilities had been seamless throughout their approach, creating a protected environment that eliminated external complications and allowed Sarah to focus entirely on flying the aircraft. The decision to arm the ground spoilers and verify that the autobrake system was configured properly represented the final preparations for landing that would help the massive aircraft decelerate safely after touchdown. Captain Martinez explained these systems while Sarah continued flying the approach, her hands never leaving the primary flight controls that demanded her constant attention. The knowledge that the aircraft possessed multiple systems designed to assist with landing provided some reassurance, though she understood that successful touchdown would depend primarily on her ability to control the aircraft's flight path. Sarah's confidence had grown throughout the approach phase, but she remained acutely aware that landing would require precision that was far beyond anything she had yet demonstrated. The mathematical precision required for a safe landing involved managing multiple variables simultaneously while making split-second decisions based on rapidly changing conditions. Everything she had learned during her improvised training would be tested in the most unforgiving environment that aviation could provide. The passenger cabin maintained its atmosphere of controlled tension as passengers prepared for landing by following standard safety procedures that took on additional significance given their unusual circumstances. Many had written letters to family members or made peace with the possibility that this flight might be their last, but the professionalism displayed by the cabin crew provided reassurance that everything possible was being done to ensure their safety. The collective hope and determination of everyone aboard created an emotional environment that strengthened Sarah's resolve to succeed. Emergency coordination continued as Flight 882 descended through 500 feet on final approach to runway 25 left. Medical teams stood ready to provide immediate assistance for Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Williams, while fire and rescue personnel prepared to respond to various scenarios that might develop during the landing attempt. The presence of news media at the airport reflected the unprecedented nature of their situation, though Sarah remained unaware of the international attention that her effort was receiving. The final 200 feet of approach required Sarah to transition from instrument flying to visual references as the runway environment became clearly visible through the cockpit windows. Captain Martinez coached her through this critical phase, explaining how to judge the aircraft's height above the runway, while maintaining proper airspeed and descent rate. The visual illusions that affected all pilots during landing approaches were particularly challenging for someone learning these techniques in real time while flying an actual aircraft loaded with passengers. Dr. Morrison's final assessment of the medical situations confirmed that both incapacitated crew members remained stable enough to survive the landing attempt, though both would require immediate hospital intervention upon arrival. Her presence in the cockpit provided reassurance that medical emergencies were being handled professionally, while also serving as a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change during the critical moments surrounding touchdown and landing rollout. The moment of touchdown came with a jarring impact that sent vibrations throughout the Boeing 747's massive structure as Sarah's control inputs brought the aircraft into contact with runway 25 left. The landing was harder than what passengers might expect from an experienced crew, but the aircraft remained under control as the main landing gear absorbed the impact, and the massive weight transferred from the wings to the runway surface. Sarah's hands moved instinctively to the throttles as Captain Martinez had instructed, reducing power while maintaining directional control as emergency systems activated automatically. The ground spoilers deployed as designed, destroying the wings lift and helping transfer the aircraft's full weight to the landing gear for maximum braking effectiveness. Sarah felt the aircraft decelerate as the autobrake system engaged, though she maintained manual control of the rudder pedals to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway centerline. The Boeing 747's momentum carried it forward at what seemed like impossible speed despite the multiple systems working to slow its progress toward the far end of the runway. Emergency vehicles immediately began following the aircraft as it rolled down the runway, their crews prepared to respond to fire, medical emergencies, or any other complications that might develop during the landing rollout. The sight of these vehicles through the cockpit windows provided reassurance that help was immediately available, while also serving as a reminder of how serious their situation had been throughout the entire flight. Sarah continued applying techniques that Captain Martinez had taught her for maintaining control during the critical transition from flight to ground operations. The aircraft finally came to a complete stop approximately 6,000 feet down the runway. Its massive bulk now safely supported by solid ground, rather than the aerodynamic forces that had sustained it throughout their Pacific crossing. Sarah's hands remained on the controls for several seconds after the aircraft stopped, her mind processing the reality that she had successfully landed a Boeing 747 with no previous aviation training. The achievement seemed impossible even as she sat in the captain's seat of the aircraft she had somehow managed to bring safely to Earth. Captain Martinez's voice carried profound emotion as he congratulated Sarah on accomplishing something that aviation experts would analyze and discuss for decades to come. His experience as a flight instructor had exposed him to thousands of pilots learning to fly commercial aircraft, but he had never witnessed anything comparable to Sarah's rapid acquisition of skills under circumstances that would have overwhelmed most people regardless of their training or experience. Emergency medical teams boarded the aircraft within minutes of its arrival at the gate, immediately beginning treatment for Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Williams, while also evaluating Sarah for signs of stress or fatigue that might require medical attention. Dr. Morrison provided detailed briefings on both patients' conditions throughout the flight, ensuring continuity of care as hospital-based specialists assumed responsibility for their treatment. Passengers deplaned with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and amazement at what they had experienced during Flight 882's journey from Los Angeles to Tokyo. That had instead ended where it began after the most extraordinary emergency landing in commercial aviation history. Many approached Sarah personally to express their appreciation for her courage and skill, though she remained somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had accomplished under circumstances that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. News media coverage of Flight 882's emergency landing dominated international aviation reporting for weeks, with experts analyzing every aspect of Sarah's performance while acknowledging that her success challenged conventional understanding of human capability under extreme pressure. The Federal Aviation Administration initiated comprehensive studies of the incident to identify lessons that might improve emergency procedures and pilot training programs. Sarah returned to her position with Meridian Financial, though her perspective on risk management and crisis leadership had been permanently altered by her experience aboard Flight 882, the negotiation skills that had served her well in international business proved surprisingly relevant to aviation, though she maintained that her success had depended more on the expertise of Captain Martinez and the support of everyone involved in her emergency training than on any innate ability she possessed. The presentation to Nakamura Industries was rescheduled for the following week, where Sarah found that her reputation for remaining calm under pressure had been enhanced considerably by news coverage of her aviation adventure. The contract negotiations proceeded successfully, though she discovered that her approach to risk assessment had been influenced by her experience managing genuinely life-threatening situations rather than the financial risks that had previously seemed so important. Captain Rodriguez recovered from his cardiac event after several weeks of hospital treatment, though his commercial flying career was ended by medical conditions that disqualified him from returning to airline service. His gratitude to Sarah for bringing his aircraft and passengers safely home was expressed in a personal letter that she treasured more than any business achievement in her career. First Officer Williams returned to flying after her medical issues were resolved, carrying with her the memory of the most extraordinary emergency she had ever experienced. Her recommendation that Sarah be offered flight training by Pacific Airways was politely declined, as Sarah had decided that her single flight as an airline pilot would remain the beginning end of her aviation career. The Boeing 747 that Sarah had landed was thoroughly inspected and returned to service after engineers confirmed that her somewhat firm touchdown had caused no structural damage beyond normal wear and tear. The aircraft continued flying Pacific routes for several more years, though crew members who flew it often remarked on the unusual distinction of piloting an aircraft that had been successfully landed by someone with no aviation training. Sarah's story became a case study in business schools around the world, illustrating principles of crisis leadership, rapid learning under pressure, and the importance of remaining calm when facing seemingly impossible challenges. Her experience demonstrated that exceptional circumstances could reveal capabilities that people never realized they possessed, though she always emphasized that her success had depended on the expertise and support of many other people rather than individual heroism. The Federal Aviation Administration's analysis of Flight 882's emergency concluded that Sarah's success had resulted from an unprecedented combination of factors that included her analytical background, the quality of coaching she received, favorable weather conditions, and what could only be described as extraordinary good fortune. The incident led to revised emergency procedures that better addressed scenarios involving the complete incapacitation of flight crews. Years later, Sarah continued to receive invitations to speak about her experience at aviation conferences and business leadership seminars, though she always insisted that the real heroes of Flight 882 were Captain Martinez, Dr. Morrison, and the many other professionals who had made her success possible. Her perspective on the incident remained that she had simply been the person available to apply their expertise under circumstances that no one could have predicted or fully prepared for. The memories of that Pacific crossing remained vivid throughout Sarah's life, serving as a reminder that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded their very best efforts. Her experience aboard Flight 882 had taught her that the boundaries of human capability were far more flexible than most people realized, and that the combination of knowledge, determination, and support from others could overcome challenges that seemed impossible to face alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.